This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 955 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. Last week's sleeper show was pretty solid. Russell Wilson, Bryce Young, and Drake May were all viable streamers. That was a plus. Antonio Gibson had his best fantasy outing of the season. Adam Thielen had a big day. Hunter Henry was a top 10 tight end. Even Tommy Tremble and Theo Johnson were decent. And the wide receivers with hyphenated last names, they both found the end zone. Now, on the flip side, I did say it was going to be a Ladd McConkey day given the matchup in Atlanta, but I called out Josh Palmer too. He did next to nothing. The Chargers' backfield was also a disappointment. Xavier Legette didn't work out, and nothing really happened with the Colts' passing attack. So overall, I think it was an above-average week for sleepers. Let's keep things moving into Week 14. Now, before getting to the sleepers, I want to remind you to check out Underdog. There are tons of snake drafts you can join right now over on Underdog. For not just this week's slate of games, but for the playoffs as well. That's right, playoff best ball is here. And there's one contest, the Gauntlet, that's a $25 entry with $2 million in prizes. If that's too high of an entry point for you, you can also join the $3 per entry Little Mitten. That's where there's $50,000 in prizes. There's always something at Underdog that will fit what you're looking for. If you've never played there, make sure you sign up right now with promo code LATEROUND. You can get a nice deposit offer with that promo code. You can also get access to my rest of season rankings. That's UnderdogFantasy.com, promo code LATEROUND. We'll kick things off as we usually do with players rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues, and we'll start with quarterbacks. Will Levis is currently just 16% rostered, and he gets a juicy matchup against the Jags this week. Levis himself has averaged about 17 standard fantasy points per game over his last 4. He hasn't dipped below 15.6 points during that time. The Jags are the top matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed, and they've given up the most adjusted passing yards this season as well. So I think Levis makes sense as a QB2 type this week who could find your lineup if one of your quarterbacks is on bye. Jameis Winston has a really tough matchup on paper against the Steelers this week. In fact, Pittsburgh ranks as the toughest matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. But he's been in some pretty mediocre positions so far this year, and he's been okay. Like last week, he posted 33 points against Denver. Cleveland has had a really strong drop back over expected rate in 6 of their last 7 games. And unlike the last time they faced Pittsburgh, this game is not projected to be in a snowstorm. And it's in Pittsburgh. That's making the Steelers pretty strong favorites, which could lead to another high volume day for Jameis Winston. And he's the type of fantasy quarterback that you would want in that scenario. Now moving on to running back in this tier, let's go to that same game. Let's go to Jerome Ford. Now, I mentioned Ford the last time the Browns faced the Steelers, and it was an L. But that game script was weird, and the weather played a role in how those offenses operated. This week, I think there's the potential for a Ford game. Pittsburgh ranks as an above-average opponent for running backs by adjusted points allowed, and they've given up an above-average target share per game rate too. That benefits Ford. If this game script goes south, then that'll really help Ford as well. He saw 62% route share last week. He's been in a 56% route share since Nick Chubb returned to the field. He even outsnapped Chubb last week 55-29. So we could see some production from Ford in this one. Now at the time of this recording, I'm not exactly sure what this Raiders backfield is going to look like in Week 14 when they face the Buccaneers. If Alexander Mattison is back, I think you probably have to favor him given he was seeing 45 to 50% of the team's running back rushes before he got hurt. And those numbers were significantly higher without Zamir White, who's also banged up. Now, if both of those guys are sidelined once again for whatever reason, Sincere McCormick becomes kind of an interesting deep play. So he would be in the other tier that I'll talk about later. Now, Amir Abdullah got more work than McCormick in Week 13, but the Raiders might reward McCormick for a strong day of 64 yards on 12 carries. I just would worry a little bit about his receiving upside, because Abdullah's been playing that role for the Raiders. And in Week 13, McCormick only ran a route on 9% of Vegas's dropbacks. So monitor that situation. The Buccaneers are a better defense to throw on than run on, and that game script could go south. That would benefit someone like Abdullah if both Madison and White are out again. but McCormick is at least an interesting name to follow. Tajay Spears returned for the Titans last week, and it's almost like they didn't use him fully because he wasn't up to speed. Say what you want about them favoring Pollard. Last week was different. Spears is typically seeing double-digit percentage target shares when he plays, but he didn't see a target and he only carried the ball one time against the Commanders. I think there's a chance that changes this week against Jacksonville. Tony Pollard, he's your go-to here. I talked about that earlier in the week. But Jacksonville's the second best matchup for running backs by adjusted points allowed. And the Titans, they're favorites in this game. There may be a point in time where the Titans decide to feature Spears a little bit more if things do get out of hand. He's definitely risky, but that's why he's a sleeper. Now moving on to wide receiver, let's stick with the Titans. Let's go back to Nick Westbrook-Ikhine for like the fourth straight week. Now his touchdown luck is going to run out eventually, but his peripherals are getting better, which means there's a little bit more sustainability to his numbers. He's hit a 20% target share in each of his last 3 games. And like I said, the Titans get the Jags. That's arguably the best matchup for a passing attack in football. So he's definitely in play. Elijah Moore is averaging over 9 targets per game over his last 6. He's seen a target share per game rate of about 21% during that time frame. He's run about 61% of his routes from the slot. And he's going to face a Steelers team this week that's seen an above average percentage of targets go to slot wide receivers against them this season. If that negative game script does happen, like I talked about with Jameis Winston, that could benefit Elijah Moore, even if Cedric Tillman is back. Now, another slot matchup to potentially exploit this week is with Wan'Dale Robinson against the Saints. Robinson has a 79% slot rate this year, according to PFF. New Orleans has seen the 3rd highest adjusted target share go to slot wideouts this year. Robinson's target shares haven't been as strong of late, but maybe things turn around in a decent matchup. Romeo Doubs is going to miss another game this week, and that makes Dontavian Wicks a sleeper once again. The Packers have an implied total of almost 24 points this week in a game against Detroit, and that game has the highest over-under on the slate, so there could be scoring. Detroit's been better against the run than the pass this year from a fantasy perspective. They're the second toughest matchup for running backs by adjusted points allowed, but they're the 9th best one for wide receivers. Wicks ran around on 82% of Green Bay's dropbacks last week. He'll play as a starter in this really strong environment, and that could bring some fantasy points. And then the last wideout in this tier is Brandon Cooks. Cooks returned to action last week. He had a 19% target share while running a route on just 54% of Dallas's dropbacks. It's not hard to see a scenario where that route share, it increases this week. And the Cowboys get a Bengals team that's pretty bad across the board, but they've allowed the 5th most adjusted points to wide receivers this season. At tight end in this tier, I only have one for you, and it's Will Dissly. Dissly didn't give us the goods last week, but he did run a route on 71% of Justin Herbert's dropbacks. That's a solid number. Not only is Ladd McConkey dealing with an injury, but the Chiefs are the 3rd best matchup for tight ends by adjusted points allowed. They've also given up the 3rd highest target share to the position. That's adjusted for strength of opponent as well. So Will Dissly, solid play. The next tier of players consists of guys rostered in fewer than 10% of leagues. We're digging deeper. At quarterback in this tier, you could look at Aiden O'Connell. I actually think O'Connell's in the same tier from a rankings perspective as Jameis Winston and Will Levis this week. The Raiders get Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay is right there with Jacksonville as the best matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. They've also given up the 2nd most adjusted passing yards allowed. O'Connell looked good last week in a much tougher spot against Kansas City, so he's a decent streamer. And then there's also Cooper Rush. Rush only scored 12 points last week, but he had a 16-point and 18-point outing in his 2 games prior. He gets a Cincinnati team that, like I said with Brandon Cooks, they've been bad this year, defensively. This game's total isn't bad, and it could see one of the better paces of all the games played this weekend. That could result in more plays run. But the Bengals are the 4th best matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. The matchup is there for Rush. At running back, I have one for you in this tier. It's Kenneth Gainwell. This is simply a play on the fact that the Eagles are 12.5-point home favorites against the Panthers. And Carolina has allowed 48 running back rushing yards per game above expected this year. Meaning when teams face Carolina, their running backs have rushed for 48 more yards than their season-long averages. That's basically double the next highest team. It's a juicy matchup, and if game script goes the way that it looks like it might go, then the Eagles might opt to use more Kenneth Gainwell in this game. At wide receiver, you could pair Aiden O'Connell with Trey Tucker. Now, Tucker only saw a 3% target share against the Chiefs, but he connected on his one target for 58 yards and a touchdown. More importantly, from a forecasting standpoint, he ran a route on every single Vegas dropback last week. That should lead to more targets. And this week they get the Buccaneers, and it's a matchup that's one of the best you're going to find on paper. So he's in a good spot. I talked about Parker Washington on the 15 Transactions episode and how he's seen his 2 highest target shares of the season with Christian Kirk and Gabe Davis sidelined. That's going to be the case for the rest of the year. So he works against Tennessee this week. The matchup, though, is not anything special. It's actually pretty below average. But volume may allow Washington to be relevant this week. That's why he's getting a shout. And then a super deep play, Tim Patrick. He ran a route on 74% of Detroit's dropbacks last week, and he's seen respectable target shares of 13%, 12%, and 10% over his last 3. Now, he hasn't been amazing, and he hasn't found the end zone. But he's a deep league way of getting exposure to this game with a high total. Now, at tight end in this tier, watch the Dalton Kincaid and Jake Ferguson statuses this week. If they don't go, you can look at Dawson Knox and Luke Schoonmaker. But one sleeper that absolutely should be on people's radars is Grant Calcaterra. Dallas Goedert's out. And without Goedert for essentially 4 games this season, Calcaterra had an 88% route share and a 17% target share. Those are both really, really good numbers for a tight end. And this week, Philly gets Carolina, like I was just talking about. The Panthers ranked 10th in adjusted target share to tight ends this year. They're first in adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. It's a gorgeous matchup for a guy who's seen a lot of work with Dallas Goedert sidelined. So he makes a ton of sense. With streaming defenses this week, I mentioned the Saints against the Giants earlier in the week on the 15 Transaction show. They work, and then I did the same with the Cardinals against the Seahawks. I think those are the 2 go-tos. But if Miami's available, I like them against the Jets. And then you could go with Tennessee against Jacksonville as well. Now, finally, let's take a look at some picks that we can make over on Underdog this week. I like Will Levis higher than 208.5 passing yards. Like I said, Jacksonville allows a lot of yards over expectation, and Levis has been above that mark in each of his last 3. I also want to go with Will Dissly and Grant Calcaterra to score touchdowns. And then we'll close things up, Aiden O'Connell higher than 222.5 passing yards. You can use those if you want to or not by heading to UnderdogFantasy.com. If you're new to the platform, make sure you use promo code LATEROUND when you sign up. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. You can find me on Blue Sky as well with that same handle. Thanks for listening, everyone. I got a mailbag episode for you dropping tomorrow, and then another episode of Late Round Perspectives. I'll talk to you then.